Okay, can I just can you all hear me at the back? Good, right. Okay, what I'm going to do over the next 20-25 minutes is talk about not just the funding landscape, but some of the broader things that impact on charities and the kind of way that you're going to need to tackle. And the reason I'm doing that is that it's almost impossible to fundraise without getting some of the broader things in your organization right, without understanding some of the broader pressures on your organization and how it needs to respond to the outside world. The more practical stuff is going to happen in the workshops. My workshop, which clearly will be the best one of all, I'm going to have no slides whatsoever, and I'm going to make you guys do all the work, which is definitely my favorite kind of workshop, and I'm just going to be getting everyone to practice asking somebody else for money. And the good news is there will be an amazing prize for the people that the workshop thinks was the best person at asking for money. And if you want to know what the prize is, you're going to have to come to the workshop to find out. It's going to be repeated twice. But there we go. What I'm going to talk about now is much more of the broader pressures that the sector is under. So I'm going to talk about politics and the impact of Brexit. And I'll be really interested, I'll be staying to the end, so if any of you want to tell me a bit more about the pressures on you. I'm going to look at generations and households and give you some hints about when you were out there talking to people and discovering a bit about them, what kind of people are most likely to have money that they might give you. I'm going to talk a little bit about not-profits and why it is and how it is and what we can do about the fact we are so rubbish about rising to the digital challenge. I'm going to look at youth volunteering and particularly how youth volunteering has dramatically increased and why that might be and how you can exploit it. I'm going to talk about the rise of choice, and I'm going to ask you how long it would take you to get back to the beginning if you had a different drink from Starbucks every day of the week. How many years or months or decades would it be before you had to have the same drink again? And then we're going to look at some of the specific pressures on the funding landscape. Okay. So, here are some lovely friendly faces. One of them is unfortunately almost impossible to lose at the moment, which is our friend Mr. Trump. But we have to remember all of the outside world things impact on us. And one of the reasons that the outside world impacts on us is that government currently, between Brexit, Donald Trump, and the other things going on in the world, has almost no capacity to think about sensible social policy that might impact for the better on the kind of people that you work with. So if you want government to pass laws that will be good for the kind of things that you're doing, if you want government to release more funds, if you want government to do almost anything useful in the next 5 years, forget it. Because it has so much headspace just trying to negotiate Brexit. And my worry is that Brexit will probably dominate our thinking for the next few years. But also we have other challenges, more distant ones, but actually very real indeed. Bottom left, we have some of the flooding that's going on in the world. Bottom middle, some of the forest fires. Some of you may have seen what's happening in places like Hawaii. And of course, we have refugees and migrants from almost all over the world trying to come to our shores. So politics will set the tune for much of what happens in terms of the outside world. One of the things that I take out of that is that we need to get better at tackling some of those problems ourselves, rather than waiting for politicians to sort it. This is a look at austerity and the real wages that people are under. And I have a feeling if I move away from the microphone, you won't be able to hear me. But what you've got on the left here is people's real wages before and after inflation. So anywhere on the left-hand chart, it's below the line, people are losing money in real terms, and anywhere it's above the line, they're gaining money. Now what we hope is that going forward, people's wages will rise faster than inflation. But at the moment, it's touch and go. Inflation is quite high, and wages aren't necessarily that quite high. So the danger is that an awful lot of people, particularly if you work in the public sector, are worse off than they were a decade ago. People will have heard about the nurses, indeed the firefighters, many teachers, actually have less money in their pockets. And that's definitely a challenge when it comes to raising money. On the right-hand side, the bad news is that although we've had almost a decade of austerity now, the reality is we haven't repaid one bit of debt compared to where we were at the beginning. So the right-hand chart tells you the pink bar is the amount of overdraft that we had each year. You go back to 2009, our overdraft was about 10%. We spent 10% more than we earned as a nation. And if you look at the blue bar, that tells you how our debt has increased. And so for a government that's been tackling austerity, our debt has nearly doubled since 2010. There is an enormous debt problem we have not worked out how to solve, but it is impacting, because of austerity, on the people that you work with. At the same time, and this is where some of the good news for some people begins to creep in, we have different generations having life patterns that are increasingly different. So people who are baby boomers, roughly born pre-1964, their lives are actually comparatively doing all right. And I say that because they tended to have pensions that have been pretty good. They tended to get on the housing ladder if they were going to get on it, maybe in their 20s, and certainly, hopefully, in their 30s, if they were going to get on it. And so by the time they've hit the age of 50 or 60, they are doing quite well. So if you see somebody, broadly speaking, over the age of 50, 55, the chances are, comparatively, they're doing all right. Compare that to the millennials, people roughly speaking who are under the age of 35, and their life pattern looks very different indeed. It's going to be much harder for somebody who's a millennial to find the deposit to buy a house, and the houses are much less affordable than they were 20 or 30 years ago. It's also much more likely that they won't have a decent pension. I spend my life at nfpSynergy trying to persuade all of the people who work for me to put more money into their pension. We incentivize it in a number of ways, but the challenge is that they're repaying their student loans. They're trying to find an affordable rent to live in. Therefore, the pressures of a millennial are enormous, and in many cases they don't have any of the buffer that people maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years ago had. So millennials are going to have a very different life pattern. So one of the things I say to people is, it's rather like Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. We have maybe 7, maybe 10, maybe 15 years of relative wealth coming down the track, and at the same time, after that, coming a generation of people who will have less money. So if you're going to get major donations, if you're going to get legacies out of people, now is the time to do it. Because the generation coming after baby boomers and the one after that are actually going to be far more hard up. If we then move on to some of the longer term social changes in terms of households and generational change, this is a chart of how different household wealth structures are made up. And what you see is anywhere that is in blue tells you that group is in the top 20% of wealth of households, and those in my lovely orangey mustard are in the bottom 20%. So at the top here, couples without children are disproportionately likely to be in the wealthiest group of people. So if you're a couple, I can see a couple of people thinking that might be us, I'm getting richer as I look at this chart. So couples without children, because let's face it, what children do for you is suck out your money and spend it on themselves in a way that is totally thoughtless. So if you have kids, they're a good way of losing money. If you're a couple, you are then sharing the bills for a household, you're sharing the rent. So couples without children are a particularly disproportionately wealthy group. Couples with children, even Stevens, and you can see here the single non-elderly, the fourth one up, are disproportionately likely to be on the poor side. So again, if you're thinking about fundraising, perhaps your first question when you meet somebody, maybe a little rude, is, what kind of household do you live in? And if they go, oh, it's just me and my other half, and you go, what, no children? They go, no, no children. You go, right, I'd like to talk to you about fundraising. At the same time, what we have is an aging population. And this is, again, one of the reasons I've told you about the austerity stuff, but what you have is increasing numbers of people getting to be above the age of 50. So if you look at this chart, anywhere that's in blue tells you the number of people in that age group is going to have increased in the next 10 to 20 years. Anywhere in purple is decreased. Now, it doesn't take a genius to look at this chart and work out, roughly speaking, between the age of 16 and the age of 50, there are going to be less people, with a group in the middle who may go up. And you have over the age of 50, there's going to be more of them, and equally telling, under the age of 15. So we are squeezed at both ends. More people are going into school, more kids being born, more people going into school, more schools needed, more primary and secondary and nursery schools, more university places, more apprenticeships, more people coming into the workforce, all of which costs money. And at the same time, the over 50s, more of those into the population, more of them having pensions, more of them having the NHS and needing its resources and so on. And the challenge of that, as any of you who know how the NHS works, is that it's a double squeeze for the NHS. Not only are there more people, but we do far more for people who are in their 80s and 90s than we did a generation ago. My dad had a hip operation last year, and he's 90. How bonkers is that? But it's given him a quality of life. And actually, we increasingly expect that, and quite right, because people are much more able into their 80s and 90s and even beyond. And we have to go on accepting this will cost the NHS more and more money. So is going to be a real squeeze because of the ageing population, and the number of people earning between 60 and 50 is going to decrease. Sarah did warn you this wasn't all positive and cheerful, this talk. We've also seen a change in the way that households are structured. And so if you go back to this horizontal family, which is kind of roughly what you had in the 30s and 40s, is that people didn't live very long. They died typically in their 60s and 70s. One of the interesting stats is that if you were retiring in the 1920s, you typically lived about 3 years after the age of retirement. And now you will typically live well over 30 years after the age of retirement. So people are living much longer compared to they were when we had horizontal families. But families had a lot more kids. So you can see here, you have the two parents in the blue on the parents' side. You had lots of uncles and aunts, you maybe had grandparents, and you had lots of cousins. Then what happened is people started having less children, and they started living longer. So you went from a kind of broad horizontal family to a vertical family. And what that meant is that you had less cousins, you had less social networks on which to depend, people moved further, there were less of you overall, but you were more likely to have grandparents and great-grandparents. Then what happens, of course, is that social fabric changes, in which people then break up and reform, so that suddenly kids will have step-parents, they'll have a step, not just parents, but they'll have step-grandparents, they'll have step-uncles and aunts, and you have a much more complicated family in order to manage. And so again, the challenge is the energy of running everyday life, when it used to be that everyone said you had a nice nuclear family, and you could do all of these things above and beyond the family, is more challenging when you have family makeups, when people are saying, I don't like my stepmother at all, I don't want to live with them. People are deciding which motorway they want to spend Boxing Day on in order to make that balance between all the step families and other bits of in-laws in your life and so on. And meanwhile, the structure of households is changing because less and less of us are getting married, and more of us are living in single people. And the most significant one on this chart is the single-person households. So if you want to know why it's getting harder and harder to buy a house, it's because more and more people live on their own. So once where you had 100,000 people who needed 50,000 properties when they're in a couple, when you are single, you need 100,000 properties because you have one house per person, whereas it used to be 2 people per person, 2 people per household. So the rise in single-person households means there are a number of changes which is difficult to keep track with. So it isn't just that our population numbers are growing, it's that people need more houses overall. And if you're interested in it, the rise in one-person household changes, for example, the kind of pets that we have. So it's much better to have a cat if you're living in a single-person household than a dog, because a dog, maybe 2 of you can look after and so on. But then people have got bored with dogs, and what you may not know is there's been a big increase in the number of house rabbits. Anyone here have a house rabbit? You are the first audience I've ever talked to where nobody had a house rabbit. But that's probably because it's a northern thing to have cats or dogs or something. I wanted to talk, and somebody showed me on her mobile phone her 5 house rabbits on her screen behind her. So it's a southern thing. House rabbits, you have house rabbit cat flaps. If that's not a contradiction in terms. So single-person households change a whole range of things to do with the way you live your lives. And this is a light chart. I'm afraid it's nothing to do with any of it, but it does make me laugh. On the left, what you have is when you said to women, who is responsible for cleaning in your household? And what it said in the, so this is women, me, 70% of the people said women, 70% of women said they were responsible. When you said, okay, but what about your partner? They said about 5% of times was it their partner, and it was shared about 25% of the time. Now, what I've hidden is what men said the equivalent was, okay? So how many men do you think said, oh, I do all the cleaning, or we share it? Well, the reality is, men had a very different impression. What men said was that actually they shared it nearly 40% of the time, women said only 25% of the time, and even the men saying me doing it was 4 times more than women said it was as well. So we have a long way to go for gender equality to strike in when it comes to something as basic as household cleaning. Non-profits are struggling to embrace digital change and marketing, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of which is that it requires energy and expertise and knowledge and know-how to really get to grips with the digital world. And even in the broader digital world, whilst we have a whole range of startups, and Manchester is one of the centres of those places, Actually, what we increasingly see is the big organizations get bigger and better. The FANGs, as they're called, which is Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Actually, a huge amount of shopping now goes through Amazon, a huge amount of our TV watching habits go through Netflix, a huge amount of our other activities go through Google. And we little charity people find it really hard to flourish in that world. And it's also because people wake up in the morning and think, I want to do something interesting this weekend. What am I going to buy on Amazon? They can say, where shall I buy my holiday on the internet? They say, where shall I go and buy some stuff for Christmas shopping? Very few people wake up in the morning saying, I really must make a donation to charity this morning or my day won't be complete. And so it's very difficult for people to keep up. And there are various ways in which we may be able to change things. And one of the opportunities is in the cashless society. Now, very few people here will not have any kind of credit or debit card. There are certain portions of society who don't. But the contactless credit card and the contactless debit card has revolutionized the way we do things. And what that means is, for the first time last July, 9 months ago, the number of card-based transactions took over from the number of cash-based transactions. And what you had then is people predicting that by 2025, just a quarter of all transactions will be cashless, will be cash. And what that means is, increasingly, any of you who go around saying, let's tin rattle, is there'll be less and less rattling to put in your tin because there's less and less coins, because people don't get. And indeed, one of my colleagues in London, and this still amazes me, says she hadn't carried cash for 3 weeks. So you can't do tin rattling. You can't ask people for impulse giving. They're not going to put it in your tin rattling or your thing on the countertop or whatever if they have no cash to put. So some of the bigger organizations, and this is the challenge for small organizations, are doing cashless donations. And they're finding they raise more money because instead of going past and putting what you have in your pocket, it says, put your contactless card here to give us £3. And people find that much easier, they don't have to worry about it. And I'm still waiting for my first homeless rough sleeper to say, you can use your contactless card on my personal donation to buy the big issue. But it should come if we want people to do what they do in the rest of their lives. This is a deeply depressing chart, and what it shows is that in purple on the left is 46% of all of the advertising expenditure through all of the channels in general in the UK is now done online, just under half. And that's up from about 30% 5 years ago. If you then find out the same data for charities, it's about 5%. So we are simply not spending money in the way that the rest of the world is spending it in terms of online. We're still wedded, addicted to the grey bar, which is direct mail and door drops and that kind of stuff. So we haven't kept up with the rest of the world. We look increasingly out of touch. And at the same time, social media, those of you who are following it, is changing in a whole variety of ways as well. There's less print media, there's less serious news. We used to think that truth was supreme. We certainly don't do that anymore. There was a few mass media outlets, and the editor of the Times or the Guardian was the kingpin. Now, increasingly, many of you won't even absorb mainstream news. You'll get it from places like Facebook and Twitter. And each of you will be your own editor. You'll be sending out messages to all you people on Facebook, and they will be getting it as well. So that's one of the opportunities we have for raising funds, but it's also the reason that increasingly the Russian state allegedly can influence the US and Brexit type elections because they put things on Facebook. It's one of the reasons that individuals can raise huge amounts of money without needing to. Some of you may have heard Cumbria, where I live, somebody died in the marathon, and I think they've now raised £300,000 through the social media word of mouth of this person's died, that's terrible, we should raise something for their legacy. So the world of media is changing, and that again creates opportunities for people like you. And one of them means you need to know your language. So this is the number of people on Twitter for charities on the left. And you can see the numbers. The biggest we found, UK-based, National Trust, 719,000 followers on Twitter. That's a pretty healthy number, you may see. Dogs Trust, 247,000. But it is peanuts compared to the guys on the right, which is people with followers on Twitter. And again, I should give you a prize if you can name all of them. I couldn't, I was about too short. And if you want to afterwards, I will tell you who they all are, but you probably know them already. But when Justin Bieber, top row, second left, has 103 million people he can talk to with Twitter, the power of communications for somebody like that is incredible if you can persuade them to do the things that you want them to be doing. At the same time, we've seen a rise in youth volunteering. This is the chart going back to 2004, where 15% of young people, 16 to 24, were volunteering, and by 2013, 2014, that was up to 30% on average. So a doubling of the number of people who are doing it. What we've seen also is the middle-age groups tending to go down, busy lives, working harder, and so on. Now, there's a whole variety of reasons for this, one of which is that your school and your UCAS form and all of that says, what have you done? And you sit there and go, what am I going to put in my UCAS statement? And your parents sit there and go and do some volunteering, and then you'll have something interesting to put in your UCAS statement. And you hope to do it, or you don't, but increasingly, the competition of keeping up with education requires you to have volunteering experience. And indeed, my son went to Manchester University, where you got credits for doing volunteering. There's a whole variety of pressures on that. But when we did some recent research, and we said, what are the motivations? The motivations when you get volunteers who are young people changes dramatically. So older people, when they volunteer, tend to be much more stable. They tend to say, I'm just happy to give something back. I like the companionship. I like having a community that I can go to. Young people are absolutely in it for the experience and the expertise and what they can get out of it. And they'll be there for much shorter periods. My daughter volunteered. She left school at A-levels, very anxious, found it very difficult to kind of think about things without worrying about what was going to happen, but she wanted a job. We said, well, why don't you go and try in the Oxfam shop and do some stuff there, you can learn how to use it. She said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. She went in, she thought it was okay, she came back. After about 6 or 8 weeks, she thought it was doing pretty well and so on, and indeed she went into the local cafe and she got a job. Bingo, fantastic. A few weeks later I said to her, well, you know, you can always go back and do some more volunteering. I'm sure they'd love to see you at the Oxfam shop. And she looked at me with the disdain that only teenage daughters can muster and said, why on earth would I want to go back to somewhere that isn't going to pay me any money when I can go to somewhere that is going to pay me some money? And it was quite a hard argument to make. She had got what she needed out of the volunteering, which was enough confidence and enough skills to get a paid job. And that is the danger of youth volunteering, is that people are there to build their CVs, to build their expertise, and they won't be there for years, they'll probably be there for months, unless they have very particular motivations. We also have the rise of choice. And again, this is one of the challenges for you as charities, is that people have all sorts of choice in the rest of their lives. The average out-of-town supermarket has 40,000 items for you to choose from. That's quite a lot. And we've also seen an increase in the last 20, 30 years on TV channels, in terms of social media, in terms of supermarket products, in terms of mobile phone contracts, in terms of utility jobs. The whole area that we see is a massive increase in choice. I'm old enough to remember when actually the household cleaning products you use was limited to about 3. And this is a joke that only works for some of you. And one of them was called this weird thing called Vim. Yeah. Now Vim was a kind of abrasive that, as I remember it, my mother used to put in the bath just to make sure it wasn't that comfortable to be in the bath, because you'd sprinkle it all around and you'd get in it and it just felt like this fine sand was there, designed to stop the bath being very comfortable. Nowadays, there are something like 30 different types of cleaning product for the average bath. So we have seen a massive rise in even the simplest of things. And this is my quiz. If you went to Starbucks and got a different drink every day, how long before you'd have to have a drink for a second time? Anyone care to guess?
2 years.
3 years?
Never been to Starbucks.
Never been to Starbucks? Any advance on 3 years?
10 years.
Okay, let me give you a clue. This is a Starbucks sign saying they have 87,000 drink combinations, okay? So, and this works even if you haven't been to Starbucks. So you then do the sums and you say, okay, 87,000 divided by 5 days a week, divided by 52 weeks a year is 334 years before you had to have the same drink again. So the rest of the world has this incredible choice. And we in charities tend to be quite limited in our choices that we offer people. And that's one of the challenges, because people's individual lives are changing in a whole variety of ways. And the question is whether you as charities and community organisations can keep up with all those choices they have. And it applies to things like volunteering. If you say, we'd love you to volunteer, but it's a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, they go, oh, yeah, well, actually, I can't do that. When else can you do? Oh, well, that's what we offer you, and so on. So one of the challenges for charities is how do you keep up with the kind of lifestyle people have elsewhere? So let me get on to my final area, the funding landscape. But one of the things that is really important, I think, to understand when it comes to giving is that we are not rational. We have no rationality. Apart from anything else, giving is not a rational activity. You've got to think about the fact that you're asking somebody to give their hard-earned cash to somebody they have never met and probably will never meet for the most part. So they slave away, they earn their money, and then you want them to give it to somebody else when they've got families, they've got all sorts of better things they do. So the first thing any giving needs to do is offer a better reason to spend their money on you, an organisation, than they would get spending it on a holiday or a book or other kinds of leisure activities or the latest wheel or whatever your kids want and so on. But also, we are not rational. So lots of people in charity say, oh, it's terrible. We don't have that many people who suffer from our condition, or we have a very small client group, whatever else it is. And in today's world, that matters not at all. Because one of the things we increasingly see is that it's often much easier to raise money for individuals than it is to raise money for large groups of anonymous people. The more you can make an appeal personal, the better. I talked earlier about the marathon runner who dropped dead in the London Marathon on April the 23rd. Tragic story. £300,000 has been raised so far. There was a chap up in the northeast who was mugged, and somebody said, well, what they'd like to do is to raise some money for him. They thought they might get to £500, but they got to over £300,000. And indeed, if you give studies to people and you give them two different types of things that they can raise money for, and the first one is to get people in a group to donate to a fund for medical equipment to help one child or 8 children, the chances are they say they would give more money to the one child than in the 8th child. Because it's all about people giving to people. Some of you may have seen the recent stuff about Charlie Gard in London at Great Ormond Street, and again the other child at Alderhay Hospital. Individual children, particularly children, raise huge amounts of public sympathy. Giving is not rational. So never worry about how many people, but what it does mean is increasingly you can't say, we have a very worthy cause, this many people suffer from it, this many people are going to need whatever. You have to absolutely say, it's about this individual person who needs your help, and this is why. It has to become human stories, and that may be something you as an organisation find difficult to deal with. So what is the pressure on funding? Well, it's coming from a number of areas. Top of the tree is tighter fundraising regulation. Some of you may know we now have a fundraising regulator, so if you are, and most of you probably are, spending over £100,000 a year on fundraising, you will be subject to the fundraising regulator's strictures and policies and processes. And probably most people who expect your fundraising to follow that kind of model, even if you aren't technically within that. At the same time, we have the introduction of GDPR. Now, most of you, including me, have probably been bored rigid by presentations on GDPR, but we are all going to have to be GDPR compliant after May the 25th. It's a whole bunch of stuff, but it makes it harder to talk to people without their consent. And that's the bottom line. And indeed, I'm sure Mac is doing some stuff about GDPR, but it simply makes it more difficult to talk to people and ask them to give you money. We also have the high cost of enterprise and trading. So many of you said, actually what we need to do is run a scheme that raises money for us in order to do things that we want. And the bottom line is, from our studies of the Charity Commission Register, you are doing well as a charity if for every £100 you spend on the cost of an enterprise, you raise an additional 30. In other words, you spend 100 and raise 130 pounds. That's a good return. Anyone who runs a charity shop that raises £100,000, spends £100,000 a year and raises 130, that's a pretty good return overall, because it's an expensive business, or whether it's a training business or anything else. The cost of fundraising is high as well. If you go and look at the register, you'll discover some charities are quite happily, or quite unhappily, spending half of all they earn from fundraising, half of it goes on costs. It is an expensive business. Meanwhile, the larger charities have economies of scale. So the big guys, particularly those who work in a social services type arena, the Barnardos, the Children's Society, and all those other people who get local government contracts, are very good at bidding for them, are very good at saying these are our policies and our processes, and that makes it more difficult for you, smaller organisations, to get involved. And at the same time, we have a rise in the importance of brands and profile. People increasingly say one thing and do another. In other words, they say, if you say to them, do you want to give to a little local charity? They go, oh, yes, 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 yes. And you say, who have you given to? They go, oh, Barnardo's, Oxfam, Macmillan. So they want to have given to the local charities, but actually, by and large, who they've heard of tend to be the bigger charities. And meanwhile, the last two pressures on you are both we have national budget cuts at the national level and local government budget cuts. And we did a report a couple of years ago looking at some of the impact of local government budget cuts on people and how people are responding. And indeed, one of the tragedies is I don't think the sector has responded particularly coherently or particularly vocally to the fact that local government spending more than any other area has been cut down. So what do you do about this, other than come to the workshops you're about to see? One is be very, very focused on your mission. The more focused you are, the better it will be for making sure that you do what you want. And then decide what costs really matter. If your organisation has financial problems, the first thing you need to do is cut costs. Because most fundraising will take around 2 years to kick in and raise a decent amount of money. That would be my rough rule of thumb. You need to look for partnerships with other organisations. Can you share offices? Can you share human resources functions or payroll functions or finance functions to keep your costs down? And then you've got to start thinking 6 or 12 or 18 or 24 months ahead, because it probably takes that long to change the course of an organisation that has particular financial challenges. Very difficult for anybody to really save themselves if all they have is 1 month's funding left in the bank. And that's what happened when Kids Company came around. They had very little funding. They had no buffer. They'd been told repeatedly, and the trustees had not taken the advice to say, right, we have a volatile funding source, and we actually need to do something. And they were huge and very well known. There are lots of, sadly, much smaller organisations who find it extremely difficult to find the reserves in order to make sure they're keeping going more than living hand to mouth. And then organisations need to look for alternative sources of funding. And again, if you come to mind, it may be helping you to talk to people you think have money and why they're going to give it to you. And again, perhaps the last thing to say is sometimes you may think you're a doing organisation. I would encourage people to think about whether they're an ideas and influence. So some of the most powerful organisations aren't those that do, they are those that say, why don't we do it like this? How about thinking about it like this? How about changing our approach overall to things? Because they are the kinds of organisations that say, you know what, we may not have much ideas, but our ideas can be spread to other people to get them to take it up and so on, even if we don't have a massive base of doing themselves. And they are often the ones at the local level that will say, we need to think differently. We think the same as we've always done, we have the same problems that we've always done. So my final thing is to say, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, we do have a massive range of free reports on our website. We've got the charity expenditure one I talked about, ad infinitum. We've just published earlier this year a more detailed one looking at pest analysis and the kind of forces in your organisation, 48 pages. Volunteering trend data as well, Gdpr, that subject we're all going to have to deal with, though none of us really love, and probably another 60, 70, 80 other free reports that you may or may not find useful. So I hope that's been useful. I do apologise for the whirlwind, but thank you very much.